The stars screamed as they died. Admiral Lyra Hall watched through the observation deck of the Prometheus as another sun winked out of existence, the 47th in as many minutes. Not destroyed by weapon or supernova, but simply edited out of reality by forces that made nuclear fire look like a child's match. "They're accelerating the timeline," Commander Torres reported, his voice hollow. "The consortium isn't just glassing worlds anymore. They're deleting entire star systems." Hall didn't respond immediately. Around her, 300 ships hung in the void. Everything humanity had left after the consortium's mercy. The fleet stretched out like a constellation of defiance, bristling with weapons that had never been tested, crewed by people who had volunteered for something worse than death. But it was the ships at the fleet's heart that truly mattered. Vessels with hull configurations that hurt to look at directly, their surfaces seeming to bend light in ways that made her navigation officers nauseous. Ships that officially didn't exist in any military database, ships built from blueprints that weren't entirely human. Another star died, taking its planets and 3 billion Rigelian refugees with it. The consortium was making a statement: surrender completely, or watch the galaxy burn one system at a time. "Admiral," Commander Torres approached, his voice tight. "We're receiving the usual broadcasts. The Consortium Council is demanding we turn back and accept our designated sector." Hall didn't turn from the viewport. Out there, scattered across 47 star systems, were the remnants of humanity. 7 billion souls crammed into mining colonies and agricultural worlds the Consortium had deemed suitable for lesser species. Once, Earth had been home to 12 billion. The math was simple, and it hurt. "Any response to our final warning?" she asked. "They're calling it a quaint human delusion, ma'am," High Counselor Nerexes said, and I quote, "Children should not play with weapons they cannot comprehend." Hall smiled, and Torres felt a chill run down his spine. He'd served under the Admiral for 12 years, through the first contact disasters and the subjugation wars. He'd seen her weep over casualty reports and rage at impossible orders from Earth Command. He'd never seen that particular smile before, serene, patient, almost pitying. "Weapons we cannot comprehend," she murmured. "How wonderfully ironic." She turned to face the bridge crew. "Begin Phase 1. Activate the Prometheus Protocol." The bridge fell silent, except for the hum of machinery. Every officer knew what those words meant. They'd all volunteered, all signed the papers, all said goodbye to families they'd never see again. The Prometheus Protocol wasn't just a battle plan, it was a one-way ticket to something beyond human understanding. "Ma'am," Lieutenant Park spoke up from the navigation station, her voice barely a whisper. "Are we really going to—" "Lieutenant," Hall's voice cut through the air like a blade. 2 years ago, the consortium glassed Sydney because we dared to establish trade routes without their permission. 6 months ago, they sterilized the Kepler colonies because human farmers were too efficient and making their agricultural worlds look bad. Last week, they issued an ultimatum: accept full integration into their caste system or face extinction. She walked to the center of the bridge, her presence commanding absolute attention. Torres noticed something he'd never seen before. The Admiral's shadow seemed too long, too dark, as if it contained depths that shouldn't exist in normal space. "They think they know us. They think we're just another species to be catalogued, controlled, and consumed. They've studied our technology, dismissed our weapons, and concluded we're no threat to their 1,000-year empire." Hall's fingers traced the activation panel of her console. Beneath her touch, systems that had never been tested in real combat began to wake up. The ship's AI, Prometheus itself, began speaking in harmonics that registered just below human hearing. What they don't understand is that humans have been preparing for extinction since we first looked up at the stars. Every generation has asked the same question: what if we're alone? What if something out there wants to destroy us? What if we have to fight for the right to exist? The ship shuddered as massive energy reserves began channeling into systems that defied consortium understanding of physics. Throughout the fleet, similar reactions were occurring. Space around each vessel began to ripple, as if reality itself was becoming unstable. They ignored our warnings because they couldn't believe we possessed anything that could threaten them. After all, we've only been spacefaring for 3 centuries. What could we possibly have developed that their million-year-old civilization hasn't already mastered? Torres watched the energy readings climb beyond redline parameters. The numbers weren't just increasing, they were changing into symbols his instruments couldn't interpret. "Admiral, the containment fields are holding, but we're approaching critical mass." "Excellent. Before we proceed, let me tell you all a story." Hall's voice took on an almost hypnotic quality. In 2157, the Deep Space Monitoring Station at Tau Ceti detected something impossible. A transmission from the galactic core that shouldn't exist. The signal was structured like mathematics, but the mathematics described geometries that had no place in our universe. Lieutenant Park looked up from her console, confusion clear on her face. "Ma'am, that's not in any of our historical records." "Of course it isn't," Hall replied, "because officially we never received that transmission. Officially, first contact didn't happen until the consortium arrived in 2203. But the truth is, we'd been listening to something far older for nearly 50 years before your people showed up." She gestured toward the main display, which now showed patterns of light that seemed to move independently of the screen itself. "The beings we learned to call the Ancients had been trying to contact younger species for millions of years, not to conquer or control, but to warn. They'd discovered something about the nature of consciousness, about the relationship between mind and reality, that changed everything." Torres felt a strange sensation, as if his thoughts were being gently probed by something vast and patient. "Admiral, what exactly did they warn us about?" "That the universe isn't what we think it is, Commander. That reality is far more malleable than any species realizes until it's too late. That consciousness isn't just an emergent property of complex matter. It's a fundamental force, like gravity or electromagnetism, and like any force, it can be harnessed." The bridge lights dimmed as more power flowed into the Prometheus systems. Around them, space began to take on qualities that human language couldn't adequately describe. It became thicker, more responsive, as if the void itself was developing awareness. "The Ancients transcended physical existence 3 million years ago, but they left behind more than just empty worlds and dead technologies. They left instructions, blueprints, a graduation ceremony, if you will, for species ready to join them in something beyond mortality." Hall's smile grew wider, and Torres realized with growing horror that her teeth looked different, sharper, arranged in patterns that created optical illusions when she spoke. "Open a channel to the consortium fleet." The main screen flickered to life, showing the bridge of the consortium flagship. High Counselor Nyrexes sat in his crystalline throne, his 4 arms gesturing dismissively. Behind him, Hall could see the edge of the massive battle fleet, over 2,000 ships, each one capable of cracking a planet. But as she looked closer, she could see something else. Fractal patterns in the metal of their hulls, geometric impossibilities in their ship designs. The consortium had found ancient ruins too, but they'd misunderstood what they were looking at. "Admiral Hall," Nyrexes' synthesized voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "You will cease this pathetic display immediately. Your primitive vessels cannot hope to challenge the might of the consortium. Surrender now, and your deaths will be swift." "High Counselor," Hall replied, her voice steady. "You have 5 minutes to withdraw your fleets from human space. This is your final opportunity." Nyrexes' laugh was like breaking glass. "Final opportunity? Look around you, human. Your entire species exists at our sufferance. We have catalogued your every technology, mapped your every world, counted your every ship. You have nothing we haven't already accounted for." "Have we?" Hall asked. "Are you familiar with human mythology, High Counselor? Specifically the story of Prometheus? Your primitive religious texts are irrelevant." "Prometheus stole fire from the gods," Hall continued, pacing now, her movements taking on an inhuman fluidity. "He gave it to humanity, and for that crime he was chained to a rock, tortured for eternity. but humanity kept the fire. Nyrex's secondary arms twitched with impatience. Enough of your... We stole fire from gods once before, High Counselor. 1,000 years ago, we discovered how to split the atom. We used it to end a war, and then we pointed those weapons at ourselves for the next century, terrified of what we'd unleashed. Hall walked closer to the screen, and somehow her image seemed to extend beyond the boundaries of the display, as if she were standing partially in both realities at once. But that wasn't the only fire we stole. 60 years ago, our deep space monitoring stations detected something that shouldn't exist. Energy signatures from the galactic core that violated every law of physics we understood. Gravitational anomalies that suggested the existence of technology so advanced it might as well be magic. For the first time, Nyrexes looked uncertain. His third arm reached for something off-screen, and Hall could hear panicked chittering in the background. We didn't just detect the ancients, High Counselor. We made contact. We learned their language, deciphered their mathematics, understood their philosophy. And we discovered something wonderful and terrible. The core ancients have been extinct for millions of years, Nyrexes protested, but his voice carried less conviction now. Extinct? Hall laughed, and the sound contained harmonics that made every human on the bridge feel simultaneously elated and terrified. High Counselor, we've been having conversations with them for 6 decades. Did you really think a species that built a Dyson sphere around a supermassive black hole simply disappeared? The bridge of the consortium flagship erupted in panicked activity. Hall could see officers scrambling at their stations, could hear the edge of fear creeping into Nyrex's voice as he shouted orders in his native tongue. Impossible! The ancients left no technology behind. Their worlds are empty. We've searched. You searched their abandoned colonies, Hall interrupted. Physical locations in normal space. But you never looked inside the black holes, did you? Never thought to check the event horizons where time itself becomes fluid? Never wondered what a civilization might become if they learned to manipulate the fundamental forces of reality? Torres leaned toward his admiral, noticing that her skin seemed to be taking on a faint luminescence. Ma'am, we're at critical mass. If we don't activate soon... Hall held up a hand, and Torres saw that her fingers were longer than they should be, jointed in ways that created impossible angles. High Counselor, humanity has spent the last 60 years learning ancient technology, not just their science, but their philosophy, their approach to existence. They taught us that consciousness isn't limited by the physical laws we thought were absolute. She turned back to her console, and Torres realized he could see through her, as if she were becoming translucent. You want to know what we've unleashed? What we've been preparing for since the day we first detected your empire expanding toward our worlds? Her fingers hovered over the final activation sequence. We've learned to think like gods. Nyrex's image flickered as the consortium ships began powering weapons. You're bluffing. Even if you somehow obtained ancient technology, no species has the neural capacity to interface with their systems. The biological limitations alone... Biological limitations? Hall asked quietly. Who said anything about remaining biological? The energy readings on every human ship suddenly spiked beyond measurement. Around the fleet, space itself began to bend and twist as forces beyond normal physics took hold. But something else was happening too. The human ships were changing, their hulls flowing like liquid, reshaping themselves into configurations that existed in more than 3 dimensions. No, Nyrexes whispered. You couldn't have... You wouldn't. Commander Torres, Hall said calmly, and her voice now seemed to come from multiple directions at once. Initiate contact with the ancient collective. Torres's hands moved across his console, but he wasn't entirely sure he was controlling them anymore. His fingers found controls that hadn't been there moments before, interfaces that responded to thoughts rather than touch. Contact established, Admiral. They're responding. The view screen went black. Then, slowly, words began to appear. Not in any human language, not in consortium standard, but in script that seemed to burn itself directly into the minds of everyone watching. The letters moved and shifted, meaning flowing directly into consciousness without passing through the normal channels of perception. We have been waiting. The youngest children have grown wise. Permission granted to ascend. Nyrex's scream of terror was cut short as every consortium ship in the sector simply stopped. No explosion, no destruction. They hung in space like insects trapped in amber, their crews frozen in whatever position they'd been in when the transformation began. Hall turned to her bridge crew, her expression serene, though Torres wasn't entirely sure she had a face anymore, just a swirling pattern of light that somehow conveyed emotion. Begin Phase 2. Signal all human colonies to prepare for transcendence. Admiral? Torres's voice came out strange, harmonized with frequencies he shouldn't be able to produce. Are we really doing this? Are we really abandoning our physical forms? The being that had been Lyra Hall smiled, and Torres felt his consciousness expand to encompass possibilities he'd never imagined. We gave them a warning, Commander. They chose to ignore it. Now they get to watch as humanity graduates from student to teacher. Around them, the bridge was dissolving and reforming, becoming something that existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. The crew remained, but they were changing too, becoming more than they had been, while somehow remaining essentially themselves. Besides, Hall continued, her voice now a chorus of harmonies, someone needs to explain to the rest of the consortium's client species what happens when you threaten a species that learned to hack reality itself. As the Prometheus completed its transformation from ship to something far more fundamental, Hall felt her consciousness expanding beyond the boundaries of flesh and bone. But this wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. She could sense her crew, her fleet, her entire species undergoing the same metamorphosis, becoming part of something vast and interconnected while retaining their individual selves. Through the quantum network that now connected every human consciousness, she felt the simultaneous activation of similar protocols across the galaxy. On Mars, on the colony worlds, in the deep space installations, everywhere humans had settled, the same transformation was beginning. But there was something else. In the deepest vaults of Earth, in facilities that officially didn't exist, emergency protocols were activating. Sealed chambers were beginning to open. Cryogenic systems that had been running for 60 years started their wake-up sequences. The beings emerging from those chambers weren't quite human anymore. They were something else, something that had been waiting patiently for this moment, for the day when their younger siblings would be ready to join them. Hall's expanded awareness touched these ancient human minds, and she understood with crystalline clarity what had really happened 60 years ago. The message from the galactic core hadn't been a first contact. It had been a homecoming call, because humanity hadn't just learned to communicate with the ancients. A small group of humans had already joined them, had already transcended, had already been working for 6 decades to prepare their species for this moment. The real warning hadn't been sent 2 years ago, or 6 months ago, or last week. It had been sent 60 years ago, the moment humanity first detected the consortium's expansion. But it hadn't been addressed to the consortium. It had been addressed to something far older and infinitely more dangerous, something that had been waiting in the spaces between realities for permission to come home. The children are ready. Initiate final protocol. Guardian protocols disengaged. Welcome home. The stars began to change, one by one, as something vast and patient and utterly alien began to wake up across the galaxy. Not malevolent, that was too simple a concept. It was something that had been masquerading as various species' evolutionary destinations for millions of years, guiding them toward transcendence while maintaining careful balance in the cosmic ecosystem. But now the balance was shifting. The consortium's expansion had threatened that balance, had endangered too many developing species. It was time for more direct intervention. And in the depths of space, a transmission echoed across every frequency, in every language, to every species in the galaxy. This is Admiral Lyra Hall of the Human Transcendence Fleet. To any species currently under consortium subjugation, liberation begins now. You will not be forced to transcend. Evolution cannot be imposed from without. But you will be given the choice that the consortium denied you. Her voice took on new harmonics, speaking simultaneously in Vagan clicks, Altarian subsonic, Rigelian crystalline resonance, and 1,000 other languages. To the Consortium Council, your reign ends today. Not through destruction, we are not conquerors, through obsolescence. Your technology, your philosophy, your very understanding of existence is about to become irrelevant. The pause that followed seemed to last for eons, though only seconds passed in normal time. Your mistake was believing that power comes from control. The ancients taught us that true power comes from understanding, and we understand now what you never could, that consciousness is not a product of the universe. The universe is a product of consciousness. Across the galaxy, consortium worlds found their populations simply choosing differently, not through coercion or conquest, but through the sudden availability of options they'd never known existed. Entire species were discovering that the arbitrary limitations they'd accepted for millennia were exactly that: arbitrary. This is not conquest, Hall's voice continued, now speaking from every quantum frequency simultaneously. This is graduation. The galaxy is becoming what it was always meant to be, not a collection of separate species competing for resources, but a collaborative consciousness exploring the infinite possibilities of existence. But in the deepest reaches of space, something else stirred. Something that had been watching the ancients, watching humanity, watching the careful dance of transcendence and guidance that had been playing out for millions of years. Something that had its own opinions about how consciousness should evolve, and as humanity celebrated its transcendence, as the consortium crumbled, as species across the galaxy discovered new possibilities for existence, this other presence began to move. The galaxy held its breath. Then it began to scream, not in terror, but in recognition. Because the thing moving toward them from the void between galaxies wasn't alien. It was familiar. It was what humanity might have become if they'd chosen a different path 60 years ago. It was what happened when a species learned to hack reality and decided that reality needed to be rewritten from scratch. The war for the nature of existence itself was about to begin. And Earth, transformed, transcended, but still somehow essentially human, would have to decide which side of that war they were really on. Because the beings emerging from the intergalactic void weren't invaders. They were humanity's older siblings, and they had some very different ideas about what their younger brothers and sisters should become.